She never saw the push coming. One moment she was just another face in the crowded office, quiet, overlooked, and easy to ignore. But when Victor Dane cornered her in the restroom that morning, everything changed. What began as a single act of cruelty would soon shatter the walls of an entire empire, exposing secrets that had been buried for years. And at the heart of it all stood Nova Johnson, a young woman who refused to stay silent, no matter how high the cost. This is the story of how she turned whispered rumors into front-page headlines, and proved that even the quietest voice can bring down the mightiest shadows. Nova Johnson stood alone in the brightly lit restroom on the 15th floor of the Barrow Construction headquarters, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the name badge pinned to her blazer. The fluorescent lights above flickered in a rhythmic stutter, casting harsh shadows across the white tile walls, and making the industrial soap dispenser glisten like a relic from some sterile world. She had been with the company only 3 weeks, just long enough to learn that smiles could be sharp as knives, and silence was often more dangerous than open hostility. As she reached for a paper towel, she caught a fleeting glimpse of her own reflection in the cracked mirror above the sink. A slender young woman with deep brown skin, dark eyes that carried both uncertainty and an undercurrent of quiet resolve. Her hair, pulled back in a neat bun, framed her oval face with the kind of disciplined elegance her mother always said made her look older than her 22 years. But Nova felt anything but mature or prepared right now. The door behind her banged open so suddenly that the sound ricocheted off the walls, making her flinch and nearly drop the stack of training manuals she was carrying. Before she could turn, a heavy hand landed on her shoulder with a force that sent a jolt of pain down her side. She stumbled forward, bracing herself against the sink's cold porcelain, the manuals slipping from her grasp and scattering across the damp floor. The sharp edges of the pages flapped against her heels as she struggled to regain her balance, her breath hitching in her throat. In the mirror, she saw him, Victor Dane, the team leader of business development, standing tall behind her with a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. His tailored suit hugged his broad shoulders, the rich navy fabric a sharp contrast to the cruelty glinting in his pale blue eyes. Victor's reputation in the company was as ironclad as the steel beams that Barrow's workers raised downtown. He was untouchable, protected by his father's position on the board, and a whisper network that seemed to operate in shadows and closed-door meetings. The office rumor mill said he'd once had an entire department head transferred to a satellite branch 3 states away, just for speaking out of turn. Nova had hoped those stories were exaggerations, half-truths spun by disgruntled employees. Now, staring into the mirror at Victor's reflection looming over her own, she wasn't so sure. "You're awfully quiet, Johnson," Victor drawled, his voice low and mocking as he leaned closer, the scent of expensive cologne clinging to his breath. "I've been watching you skulk around this floor like a church mouse. What's the matter? Can't find your voice in a place like this?" His fingers flicked at the edge of her blazer, and she fought the urge to recoil. She could feel the heat of his presence pressing into her back, a silent challenge woven into every inch of space he occupied. Behind him, 2 of his usual lackeys, Brent and Sawyer, lounged by the doorway, their arms crossed over their chests, grinning like jackals waiting for scraps. The bathroom felt impossibly small, the air heavy with the scent of disinfectant and something more primal: fear. Nova lowered her gaze, willing her trembling lips to still. She had learned, back at the community college job placement center, that sometimes the best defense was to appear meek, to offer no spark for a fire to catch. But inside, her thoughts roared like a river in flood. She thought of her grandfather's letter, the one she had found folded into a worn, leather-bound journal 2 nights before. It spoke of secrets, of under-the-table deals and quiet payments made to city officials that no one ever seemed to talk about. At the time, she had dismissed it as the ramblings of an old man who saw ghosts in every corner of this town. But now, with Victor's fingers still curled around her shoulder, she wondered if maybe those ghosts were real, and if she was staring one of them in the face. "Pick up your papers, Johnson," Victor ordered, his tone dripping with contempt as he gave her shoulder a final shove. She stumbled forward, her knee knocking painfully against the sink's ceramic edge as she crouched down to gather the scattered manuals. The damp floor had turned the corners of the papers soggy, the ink already smudging beneath her fingers. Brent let out a low chuckle as she worked, his laughter echoing off the tiles like a chorus of disdain. "Look at her," he sneered. "Think she's too good for us, maybe?" Nova said nothing. forcing her breathing to steady as she carefully stacked the manuals back into a neat pile. She could feel the throb in her side where Victor had grabbed her, a dull ache that threatened to bloom into something sharper if she wasn't careful. She told herself to be patient, to keep her head down and survive the moment. But in the back of her mind, a seed of something else was taking root, something that tasted like anger, like defiance wrapped in silence. "You're learning your place, Johnson," Victor said softly, almost as if he were offering a kindness rather than cruelty. He reached out and flicked a damp page from her stack, watching it flop wetly onto the floor again. "That's good. This is a big company, and there's no room for mistakes." His hand lingered on her shoulder for a heartbeat longer before he finally let go, stepping back with an air of bored amusement. "Come on, boys," he said, glancing at Brent and Sawyer. "Let's not keep the real work waiting." As they filed out of the restroom, Brent gave Nova a parting glance that was all teeth and no warmth. "Better hurry up, newbie," he said, his voice pitched low. "Wouldn't want to be late to the meeting. Victor hates waiting." Nova didn't answer. She waited until their footsteps faded into the hum of the hallway beyond before she exhaled, her breath shuddering in the sudden quiet. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the frantic pound of her heart beneath her ribs, and stared at her reflection in the mirror. Her dark eyes met her own in the cracked glass, and for a moment she saw not fear, but something steely and unyielding staring back. She knew that Victor and his cronies would be waiting for her to fold, to run or to break. But she wasn't ready to give them that satisfaction. Slowly she gathered the last of the manuals, straightened her blazer, and forced her shaking fingers to still. She had come to Barrow Construction for a fresh start, for the chance to prove that she could make a name for herself, even in a place that didn't want her to belong. And if this was the first battle, she would find a way to fight it on her own terms, even if the cost was higher than she'd ever imagined. Nova's heart still raced as she stepped back into the main office corridor, the stack of damp manuals clutched tight against her chest. The air outside the restroom felt no less oppressive. Rows of cubicles bathed in sterile fluorescent light stretched in every direction, punctuated by the low murmur of hushed conversations and the steady click of keyboards. She kept her head down, her gaze fixed on the thin gray carpet that muffled her footsteps. But she could feel the eyes that followed her, the curious glances of coworkers who pretended not to see but noted everything just the same. The open-plan office had always felt like a fishbowl, transparent and exposed, yet somehow claustrophobic in its forced civility. As Nova wove her way back to her workstation, she felt the weight of every whispered rumor and every sidelong glance pressing in around her like a vice. At her cubicle, she found her desk untouched, the small potted fern she had brought from home, an attempt to add a splash of life to the dull gray space, seeming to sag under the fluorescent glare. She set the manuals down with deliberate care, each movement calculated to hide the tremor in her hands. She drew a deep breath, forcing her shoulders back, and reminded herself that she couldn't let them see how rattled she was. She had always been the quiet one, the observer, the girl who knew how to listen without drawing attention. But now, she wondered if that quiet had made her an easier target. She glanced around and caught sight of Cole, the only coworker who had treated her like more than just a passing shadow. He sat a few rows away, his head bent over his monitor, a crease of concentration between his brows. When he looked up and met her gaze, she saw concern flicker in his eyes, a silent question that asked if she was all right. She gave a small nod, more for herself than for him, before turning back to her screen. Cole's presence was a thin thread of comfort in a place that otherwise felt hostile and alien. Victor's laughter still echoed in her mind, his words a cruel melody that refused to fade. "You're learning your place." The phrase rattled through her thoughts like a mantra she was determined to rewrite. She clicked through the day's assignments with mechanical precision, her fingers moving over the keyboard in practiced motions, even as her mind raced. Reports, client files, internal memos, each task a small lifeline to normalcy, an anchor to hold her steady in the maelstrom Victor had stirred up. But no matter how she tried to lose herself in the work, she couldn't shake the memory of his hand on her shoulder, the way his voice had coiled around her like a noose. As the hours crept by, the office began to empty, colleagues trickling out for late lunches or meetings, leaving the floor eerily quiet. Nova relished the stillness. She leaned back in her chair, letting her eyes drift across the rows of cubicles, each one a little kingdom unto itself, each one filled with people who had learned long ago to mind their own business. She wondered how many of them had felt the same pressure she did. How many had been cornered in break rooms, in restrooms, in parking garages, and told in soft, dangerous tones to remember their place. She thought of her grandfather's letter again, the yellowed paper folded with the care of a man who knew that the truth was both a burden and a weapon. His words came back to her in the hush of the office. Silence only protects those who profit from wrongdoing. She let the phrase settle into her bones, let it stiffen her spine. She knew now that what she carried wasn't just a family relic. It was a map to the corruption that had been allowed to fester in these hallways for years, and she was done pretending she didn't see it. The afternoon sun slanted through the narrow windows, gilding the dust motes that danced in the stale office air. Nova rose, gathering her things with a calm that belied the storm inside her. She moved down the aisle, each step measured, each breath a deliberate act of defiance. As she passed Cole's desk, he looked up again, his eyes full of questions he didn't voice. She paused just long enough to murmur, "We need to talk later." He nodded, his expression shifting from worry to resolve. That small exchange was a flicker of light in the gloom, a reminder that she wasn't completely alone in this. She continued to the stairwell where the smell of industrial cleaner and old carpet mingled in the stale air. She took the stairs down 2 flights, avoiding the main elevators where Victor and his cronies liked to linger and trade rumors. Her mind was a careful ledger, balancing every risk, every possible outcome. She didn't know yet how she would use what she had found, but she knew that she would. She pressed her hand against the door at the landing, feeling the cold metal beneath her palm. She told herself she would not be the silent one anymore. And when she stepped out onto the street, the late afternoon sun warm on her face, she felt, for the first time since she'd started at Barrow Construction, that she was no longer just an observer. She was part of the story now, and she was ready to see it through. That evening, as the city hummed with the rhythm of commuters and neon lights flickered to life in shop windows, Nova sat at the small kitchen table of her apartment, her elbows resting on the worn wood as she flipped through the pages of her grandfather's letter once more. The words, carefully inked in a hand that had once guided hers when she learned to write, carried the weight of years and the gravity of unspoken truths. She traced the loops and slashes of each letter with her fingertip, the memories of her grandfather's gentle voice weaving through the quiet of the room. He had always said that people like them, people who carried the wrong color skin, the wrong kind of name, had to work twice as hard to be seen, 3 times as hard to be heard. And even then, there would be those who would try to silence them. The letter spoke of payments made to city officials, untraceable sums that greased the gears of progress, that paved roads and built buildings while ensuring those in power never had to answer for the harm they caused. Names were listed in neat columns, dollar amounts scribbled in the margins, records her grandfather had kept not for vengeance, but for justice, should the day ever come when someone brave enough would use them. Nova read each line with a growing sense of urgency, her mind mapping connections she had never seen before, the shape of corruption taking form like a constellation in the dark. She saw Victor's name, or rather the name of his father, Leonard Dane, appearing again and again, always alongside the same officials, the same contractors who had smiled and shaken hands while cutting corners and lining pockets. She closed her eyes, the letter resting against her lips like a prayer. She had always believed that if she kept her head down, if she worked hard enough, the world would give her the chance to prove herself. But here, in the dim lamplight of her apartment, she saw the truth. The game was rigged, and the rules had never been written for her. A soft knock at her door made her jump, the letter slipping from her fingers to the table. She hesitated before rising, her pulse quickening as she crossed the room. Peeking through the peephole, she saw Cole standing in the dim hallway, his expression wary but resolute. She opened the door a crack, relief washing over her at the sight of his familiar face. "I wanted to make sure you were okay," he said, his voice low as he stepped inside, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting Victor himself to materialize from the shadows. Nova nodded, her hands twisting in the hem of her sleeve. "I'm fine," she lied, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Cole looked at her for a long moment before speaking again. "Nova, I know you're not the type to back down, but you need to be careful. Victor, he's not used to anyone standing up to him. He's not used to people who fight back." Nova swallowed hard, feeling the truth of his words settle in her chest. "I'm not going to let him scare me. she said softly, more to herself than to him. He thinks he can control everything. Everyone. But he doesn't own me. Cole's shoulders eased slightly, a small smile ghosting across his lips. Good, he said, because I have a feeling he's going to try. They talked late into the night, the letter spread between them on the table, each word a spark in the dark. Nova told him everything, about the way Victor had cornered her in the restroom, about the fear that coiled in her stomach every time she saw him. Cole listened, his brow furrowed, his fingers drumming a restless rhythm on the table's edge. You know, he said finally, his voice steady, this could be enough to bring him down. Not just him, but his father, too, if you're willing to take the risk. Nova met his gaze, the weight of that choice heavy in the silence that followed. She thought of the bruises that would bloom on her shoulder by morning, the mocking laughter she had endured in the halls of Barrow Construction. She thought of her grandfather, of the faith he had placed in the power of truth, and she realized that whatever fear she carried, it was nothing compared to the cost of silence. I'm willing, she said, her voice clear, the decision made in the quiet certainty of her heart. Cole nodded, his expression grave but proud. Then we'll figure out how to do this, he said. Together. Outside, the city breathed around them, the lights of passing cars streaking across the window pane. Nova reached out, folding the letter back along its ancient creases, and in that small gesture, she felt the echo of her grandfather's hand guiding hers once more. She didn't know yet how this would end, but she knew how it would begin, with her refusing to be silent, with her choosing to stand up, even if her voice trembled. And as she looked across the table at Cole, she knew she wouldn't have to stand alone. The next morning dawned heavy with the promise of rain, the sky a wash of muted gray, as Nova stepped out of her apartment and into the city's cool breath. She clutched her grandfather's letter in the hidden compartment of her satchel, its worn paper a quiet drumbeat against her side. Each step toward the towering glass facade of Barrow Construction felt like crossing a threshold she could never return from, her breath shallow in the cold morning air. As she passed through the revolving doors into the lobby's marble expanse, the familiar scent of coffee and printer ink wrapped around her like a shroud. The reception desk gleamed beneath the harsh lights, and she caught her reflection in the polished floor, a small figure dwarfed by the cathedral-like lobby, yet carrying a secret that could crack its foundation. She forced herself to stand taller, shoulders squared, the memory of her grandfather's calm voice whispering in her mind, "Courage isn't about not being afraid, Nova. It's about what you choose to do despite it." In the elevator, she kept her gaze fixed on the numbers that flickered overhead, each floor a countdown to the moment she would see Victor again. The doors opened with a soft chime, and she stepped out into the muted chaos of the office, the usual symphony of phones ringing and hushed conversations weaving through the air. She walked quickly to her desk, each footstep measured, her eyes darting to every familiar face that looked up from their screens, some curious, some indifferent, some with the faintest flicker of empathy. She wondered how many of them knew what Victor was capable of, how many had witnessed his quiet tyranny and chosen to stay silent. At her desk, she sat down and let her fingers hover over the keyboard, the cursor blinking on the empty screen like a pulse. She felt the weight of what she carried pressing down on her, but beneath that weight was a current of resolve she hadn't known she possessed. A quiet voice, steady and sure, telling her that this was bigger than fear, bigger than Victor's threats or the shame he tried to brand her with. She glanced up as Cole approached, his brow creased in a look that spoke of sleepless hours and shared determination. "You okay?" he murmured, his voice barely audible above the murmur of the office. Nova nodded once, a small motion that carried the weight of everything she couldn't say out loud. "I'm ready," she said softly, and in her voice was a steel that even she hadn't expected. Cole nodded, his hand brushing hers in a brief, reassuring touch before he moved on, blending back into the sea of cubicles. She took a deep breath and turned her attention to her computer, fingers flying over the keys as she drafted the day's reports, each word an act of defiance, each line a shield against the storm she knew was gathering. Mid-morning passed in a blur of numbers and charts, the mundane rhythm of work a fragile sanctuary that held her fear at bay. But beneath the calm surface, she could feel it, the tension coiling through the office like a live wire, the knowledge that something was shifting, something that could not be contained. And then, just before noon, Victor's voice cut through the low hum of conversation like a blade. "Johnson!" he called, his tone deceptively light as he leaned against the partition of her cubicle, arms crossed over his chest. His eyes, cold and appraising, locked onto hers, and she felt the old tremor start in her chest, the memory of yesterday's shove flaring hot beneath her skin. "You seem a little distracted this morning," he said, his lips curling in a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Everything all right?" Nova forced herself to meet his gaze, the words she had rehearsed all night lining up on the tip of her tongue. "Everything's fine," she said evenly, her voice calm and clear. "Just focused on my work." Victor's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it, only the cold gleam of someone who knew the taste of fear and relished it. "Good," he said softly, leaning closer until she could feel the heat of his breath against her cheek. "Because I'd hate to see you get lost in other things that don't concern you." He pushed away from the partition then, his hand brushing hers for the briefest moment, a gesture that was equal parts warning and promise. Nova watched him walk away, her fingers clenched so tightly around the edge of her desk that her knuckles ached. She could feel the eyes of her coworkers on her, some flicking away quickly, others lingering with questions they were too afraid to ask. She breathed in deeply, steadying herself, and in that breath she made a silent vow. She would not let Victor's shadow swallow her. She would not let fear define her. And as she turned back to her screen, her grandfather's words beat in her chest like a war drum, each syllable a promise that she would not be silenced. Not now, not ever. When the lunch bell chimed across the office, a hush fell over the clatter of keyboards and the soft murmur of conference calls, replaced by the shuffling of feet and the rustle of jackets pulled from the backs of chairs. Nova rose slowly, her movements deliberate, as if each step toward the break room was a march through enemy territory. She felt the weight of the letter in her bag like a brand against her side, every crinkle of the paper, a reminder that the truth she carried was bigger than her own fear. She joined the queue in the break room, the scent of burnt coffee and microwaved leftovers mingling with the low buzz of conversation. She kept her eyes on the vending machines, pretending to consider whether she wanted a soda or water, her fingers toying with the edge of her ID badge as her mind raced. Behind her, she heard the low rumble of Victor's laughter, the sound winding through the small room like smoke. She didn't turn, but she felt him there, a dark presence just out of sight, coiled and ready. She took a breath, counting in her head like her grandfather had taught her. 1, 2, 3. Stay calm, stay sharp. But then, before she could step forward, a hand landed on her shoulder, fingers pressing down hard enough to bruise. "Excuse me," Victor's voice drawled, low and silky as he leaned in close. "Didn't mean to startle you." She didn't flinch, didn't let him see the way her pulse spiked. "It's fine," she said, her voice calm as glass. He stepped around her, slotting himself into the line ahead of her, his back to her now like she was nothing more than an afterthought. The break room fell into a tense quiet, the other employees glancing away, their faces carefully blank. No one spoke up. No one challenged the silent rules that Victor had written into the air of this place. Nova's jaw tightened, the taste of defiance sharp on her tongue, but she swallowed it down. "Not here," she told herself. "Not yet." Victor turned to her then, his smile bright and false as he selected a soda from the machine. "You know," he said lightly, as if they were sharing a joke only he understood, "people like you, new people, should learn to be patient. There's an order to things." Nova said nothing, her eyes steady on his, refusing to give him the reaction he wanted. He dropped his coins into the machine, the clink of metal loud in the silence. "Patience," he repeated, his gaze lingering on her face, his meaning clear as day. She held his stare, her heart thundering in her chest, and in that moment she saw it. The flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. It was gone in an instant, but it was enough. She stepped back, her hands loose at her sides, and let him have his moment. Let him believe she was cowed. But inside, her mind was already working, piecing together the map her grandfather's letter had begun to draw. Names, numbers, transactions that connected Victor's family to the rot at the heart of this company. She would not let him see that. Not yet. Victor took his soda, gave her one last smirk, and sauntered away, his cronies trailing after him like shadows. The break room slowly returned to its hum of quiet conversations, the air still thick with the scent of reheated soup and unspoken fear. Nova let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her shoulders relaxing by a fraction as she stepped forward to retrieve her own lunch. She took her sandwich and retreated to the edge of the break room, settling into a small table by the window where the afternoon light fell soft and forgiving. She ate in silence, her eyes on the skyline beyond the glass, the sprawl of the city a reminder that there was a world beyond these walls, a world where the truth mattered. She thought of Cole, of the promise in his eyes the night before, and felt a flicker of warmth in her chest. She thought of the letter in her bag, of her grandfather's careful script, and knew that she had a weapon Victor couldn't see coming. And as she finished the last bite of her sandwich, she made herself a promise. She would be patient, yes, but she would not be silent. She would not be cowed. Not now. Not ever, Dot. That evening the city's lights winked on one by one like distant stars, and Nova found herself once again at the old storage unit her grandfather had rented for decades, a place that smelled of dust and oil, where memories slept in cardboard boxes stacked like silent sentinels. The rusted padlock clacked in her hand as she fumbled with the key, her breath catching in the cool night air. Each metallic scrape of the tumblers felt like a heartbeat, echoing in the cavern of her chest. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, the dim glow of a single bulb flickering to life above her. The unit was a time capsule, the corners crowded with relics of another era. Her grandfather's battered toolbox, crates of yellowed newspapers, the wooden trunk he'd always kept locked with a small brass latch. Nova knelt beside it, her fingers trembling as she worked the latch open, the squeal of the hinges loud in the silence. Inside, the trunk was filled with papers that smelled of age and secrets. Bank statements, city council memos, receipts scrawled with notes in the tidy hand she had always known so well. She spread them out on the floor, the concrete cold beneath her knees, and began to read. One by one, the pieces fell into place. Payments made to city inspectors to overlook shoddy construction. Contracts awarded to companies owned by friends of Victor's father, Leonard Dane. The signatures were there, the dates, years of quiet corruption recorded in ink that refused to fade. Her pulse quickened as she turned page after page, each revelation a match dropped in the dark. She took photos of the most damning documents with her phone, the soft click of the shutter, a quiet anthem of defiance. This was more than a story of office politics. This was the lifeblood of a machine that had been built to protect men like Victor, to grind down anyone who dared to question its gears. And she realized, kneeling there on the cold floor, that this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every quiet voice that had been drowned out, every whispered warning that had gone unheard. She thought of the way Victor had looked at her that afternoon, the calculation in his smile, and knew that he would not stop until he was sure she was no threat. But he had underestimated her. She closed the trunk gently, careful not to disturb the quiet dignity of her grandfather's careful records. In the glow of the single bulb, she felt his presence, his unwavering belief that truth was worth any cost, guiding her like a hand at her shoulder. She rose, tucking the phone back into her pocket, the weight of the evidence a steady drumbeat at her hip. She locked the unit behind her and stepped out into the night, the city's breath cool against her skin. As she walked to the bus stop, the distant rumble of traffic was a lullaby to her thoughts. She knew the path ahead would not be easy. She knew that Victor would come for her, that the walls he had built around himself were thick with lies and violence. But she also knew that she carried something stronger than fear. In the quiet of the bus ride home, she pressed her forehead to the cool glass of the window, watching the city flicker by in blurs of neon and shadow. Each passing streetlight was a promise, each passing face a reminder that this was a fight she was not alone in. She would be patient, she would be careful, but she would not be silent. And as the bus rumbled through the city's arteries, she felt her resolve crystallize like ice in her veins. She would see this through, no matter what it cost. Dot. The next morning dawned with the dull ache of a brewing storm. The sky a brooding slate that pressed down on the city like a held breath. Nova arrived early at Barrow Construction, her footsteps echoing in the half-empty hallways as she made her way to her desk. Her fingers brushed the hidden pocket of her satchel, where her phone rested, the photos of the documents a silent promise she carried close to her heart. She felt the weight of them in every step she took, in every breath that tightened her chest, with both fear and determination. As she settled into her chair, she noticed Cole's profile a few rows away, the pale glow of his monitor washing his features in cold light. He looked up, their eyes meeting in a glance that spoke volumes. Today was the day. She gave the smallest of nods, and he nodded back, his lips pressing into a thin line of resolve. The morning dragged in a haze of keystrokes and flickering screens, each tick of the clock like the slow beat of a war drum. At 10 o'clock, Cole slipped a folded note onto her desk as he passed by on his way to the copier, his fingers brushing hers for the briefest moment. She unfolded it with careful fingers. "Meet me at the old stairwell after third period." She tucked it away, her pulse quickening as she turned back to her work. The mundane numbers and endless rows of data, a thin mask over the storm raging inside her. When the clock struck 11, she rose from her seat, her movements fluid and unhurried, and made her way to the stairwell at the far end of the office floor. The door creaked open with a soft groan, the air inside cool and stale, lit only by the weak glow of a flickering bulb overhead. Cole was already there, leaning against the railing with his arms crossed, his eyes scanning the shadows as she slipped inside. "Nova," he said softly, his voice pitched low in the hush of the stairwell. "Are you sure about this?" She met his gaze, her chin lifting a fraction as she drew in a breath. "I'm sure," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "We can't let him keep doing this, Cole. We can't let them win." Cole nodded, his eyes dark with understanding. "I've been in touch with my brother," he said. "He knows a journalist at the local news station, someone who's been sniffing around the city council for months. If we can get these documents to her, she'll know what to do." Nova's heart thudded in her chest, each beat a pulse of both terror and fierce hope. "And Victor?" she asked, the name tasting bitter on her tongue. "He'll come for me if he finds out." Cole's jaw tightened. "Then we make sure he doesn't find out until it's too late," he said, his voice hard. "I'll get the files to my brother tonight, but we need to be careful, Nova. If he even suspects—" She swallowed hard, the taste of fear sharp at the back of her throat. But she forced herself to nod, her mind already turning over every detail, every risk. "I know," she whispered. "I'll be careful." Cole stepped forward then, his hand brushing hers in a brief grounding touch. "We're in this together," he said, his voice a promise she felt in her bones. She drew strength from it, from the quiet certainty in his eyes, and let herself believe, just for a moment, that they could win this fight. Outside, the storm clouds gathered, the first drops of rain spattering against the window pane with the soft urgency of a warning. Nova took a breath, squared her shoulders, and stepped out of the stairwell, the weight of what lay ahead pressing against her back like a second skin. She knew that this was only the beginning, that Victor and his cronies would not go quietly, but she also knew that she would not stop. Not now, not ever. And as she made her way back to her desk, the sound of the rain was a drumbeat in her ears, steady and resolute, a rhythm that matched the quiet fury of her heart. The rest of the day passed in a haze of tension, every phone call and every keystroke reverberating with the knowledge that the line between truth and exposure was growing thinner by the hour. Nova moved through the office with practiced calm, each word to her coworkers measured and careful, the echo of Cole's promise a small ember in her chest. But as the afternoon shadows stretched long across the carpeted floor, a chill prickled along her spine, the sense that the quiet was only a thin veneer, and something far darker stirred just beyond the edges. She was packing up her files at her desk when Victor's voice sliced through the low hum of conversation like a scalpel. "Nova." She looked up, her breath catching in her throat as he approached, his stride loose and casual, a predator's grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. He leaned against her desk, his fingers drumming an idle rhythm on the surface as he studied her with eyes that missed nothing. "You've been distant today," he said, his tone light but edged with something sharp. "Everything all right?" She forced her lips into a small, polite smile. "Just focused," she said quietly. "Deadlines, you know." Victor's smirk widened, his fingers pausing in their drumming as he leaned closer. "Focused," he echoed. "That's good, because in a place like this, distractions can be dangerous." The words slipped from his lips like smoke, each one coiling around her throat. She held his gaze, refusing to let him see the fear that burned low in her chest. "I understand," she said, her voice steady, even as her fingers tightened around the edge of her chair. Victor's eyes narrowed, a flicker of amusement in their icy depths. "I hope you do," he said softly, "because I'd hate to see you get in over your head." He straightened then, his smile fading to something colder, something that made her blood run slow and cold. "Some people don't know when to stop, Nova. Don't be one of them. The warning hung in the air between them, heavy as iron, and then with a final glance, he turned and walked away, his footsteps soft on the carpet but loud in her racing pulse. She watched him go, her breath coming in shallow bursts as she let her hands unclench, the sting of her nails in her palms grounding her to the moment. Around her, the office carried on as if nothing had happened. Phones ringing, papers shuffling, laughter rising in small bursts from distant cubicles. But for Nova, the world had narrowed to the cold imprint of Victor's words and the echo of her own heartbeat in her ears. She knew now, without a shred of doubt, that he suspected something, that he was circling closer with every breath she took. But she also knew that the truth she carried was more important than the fear that threatened to drown her. She rose from her desk, her movements careful and deliberate, and walked to the window that overlooked the city. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still dark, heavy with the promise of another downpour. She watched the cars below, their headlights weaving bright threads through the wet streets, and felt a flicker of determination spark in her chest. Victor could threaten and posture all he wanted. He could try to break her resolve with his veiled threats and his careful smiles, but she would not bend. She would not break. She turned from the window, her shoulders squared, her breath even. She had work to do, more than the reports and numbers that filled her days. She had a truth to deliver, and she would see it through, no matter how dark the path became. That night, the city hummed with restless energy as Nova lay in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling above her. The glow of her phone screen painted her face in pale light, the photos of the documents scrolling by like a litany of sins she couldn't unsee. Each image was a piece of a puzzle she hadn't known she'd been born to solve. Each line of numbers, each signature in her grandfather's neat script, a promise she would not let die in the shadows. She thought of Victor's words that afternoon, the chill in his tone that coiled around her ribs and squeezed until it was hard to breathe. She thought of the way the office had fallen silent at his passing, how every head had bowed just enough to pretend they hadn't seen. And in the quiet of her room, with the city's lights bleeding through the thin curtains, she felt the gravity of it all press down on her until she thought she might break. But then she remembered Cole's face in the stairwell, the steady set of his jaw and the quiet certainty in his voice when he said, "We're in this together." She clung to that, let it become her anchor as she pulled the old family trunk out from beneath her bed. She lifted the lid, the hinges sighing like an old man's breath, and sifted through the papers again. This time slower, her fingers tracing the edges of each document like she was memorizing them by touch alone. She found a page she'd missed the night before, a handwritten note her grandfather had tucked behind a stack of faded receipts. It was short, the ink smudged in places, but the words cut through her fear like a blade. "Remember, Nova, the truth is always worth the risk, even if it costs you everything." She closed her eyes, the words echoing in the hollow of her chest, and she realized she had already made the choice. She would not let Victor's threats bury her voice. She would not let his father's name blot out the light of what she had found. She would speak, and she would not flinch, no matter how loud the world became around her. With shaking hands, she packed the letter and the photos into a single folder, slipping it into the deep pocket of her satchel. She lay back then, her breath finally slowing, and for the first time in days, sleep found her. It was thin and restless, but it was enough. In the morning, she rose before the sun, the sky still bruised with the memory of night. She dressed with quiet care, every button fastened like a vow, and left her apartment in the pale hush of dawn. The city was just beginning to stir, the streets wet with last night's rain, and as she stepped onto the bus, she felt the weight of the folder at her hip like a promise she was bound to keep. The ride to the office was silent, her reflection in the window a ghost of who she'd been 3 weeks ago. She watched the city roll past, brick buildings and neon signs and the endless curve of the river, and she thought of all the voices that had been silenced in those glass towers, all the stories that had been swallowed by men who thought power made them invincible. She thought of her grandfather, of Cole, of the way her mother had always said, "You are stronger than you know, Nova," and she believed it now, because she had to. The bus hissed to a stop outside the steel and glass monolith of Barrow Construction, and as Nova stepped off, the cold air tasted sharp and clean. She took a breath, her fingers brushing the edge of the folder in her bag, and walked up the steps with her head held high. She was done being a shadow in the corner of someone else's story. Today, She would become the voice that broke the silence, and she would not look back. Nova's footsteps echoed in the polished hallway of Barrow Construction, like a quiet drumbeat of defiance, each tap of her low heels on the marble floor a deliberate act of courage. She moved with purpose, her head held high, despite the knots of tension that coiled low in her belly, her satchel heavy against her hip. The weight of the folder inside felt almost comforting, a tangible reminder that she wasn't just imagining the rot beneath the company's shiny facade. She reached her cubicle just as the office began to fill, the usual morning hum of muted conversations and clacking keyboards washing over her in a steady current. She took her seat, her fingers steady as she logged into her workstation, her eyes scanning the open floor for any sign of Victor. He hadn't arrived yet, but she knew he would come. He always did. She forced herself to breathe, her gaze flicking to the small potted plant on her desk, a splash of green in the sea of corporate gray. It was a small thing, but it reminded her of home, of the garden her grandfather had tended so carefully, of the roots he had sunk into the earth as a promise to something larger than himself. She let that memory steady her as she turned her attention to the monitor, pulling up the daily report she was supposed to review. But her mind wasn't on the numbers. Her mind was on the journalist Cole's brother had spoken to, a woman named Maribel Cortez, whose byline Nova had seen in the city's alt weekly, always beneath stories that exposed the cracks in the city's gleaming surface. She had agreed to meet them that evening, to see the evidence for herself. Nova's hands tightened around her mouse, the gravity of that meeting pulling at her like a riptide. This was no longer just about the job. It was about the truth. And she knew that once those papers were in Maribel's hands, there would be no turning back. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. At mid-morning, Cole stopped by her desk, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes flickering with urgency. "Everything good?" he murmured, his voice low enough that no one else could hear. Nova nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "As good as it can be," she said softly. She saw the flicker of worry in his eyes, but he didn't push. He just squeezed her shoulder in a quick, grounding gesture before moving on, his footsteps swallowed by the white noise of the office. She turned back to her screen, but her attention was elsewhere. Her mind played through the plan again and again, searching for cracks, for places where Victor might find a way to slip through and snatch it all away. She felt the minutes crawl by, each one an eternity of waiting, until finally the clock in the corner of her screen ticked over to noon. She rose from her chair, her hands steady even as her pulse thrummed in her throat, and made her way to the break room for lunch. She knew Victor would be there. He always seemed to appear when she was most exposed, as if he could smell her resolve and wanted to crush it in his hands. And sure enough, as she reached for a sandwich in the fridge, she felt the air shift behind her, a silence that was louder than any shout. "Nova?" Victor's voice drawled, soft and poisonous as he leaned against the counter. She turned slowly, her eyes meeting his with a calm she didn't quite feel. "Victor," she said evenly. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it, only that cold amusement she'd come to recognize as his mask. "You're working awfully hard these days," he said lightly, his fingers tapping against the counter in a steady rhythm, almost like you're trying to impress someone. She didn't flinch. "Just doing my job," she said. "That's all any of us can do, right?" His smile widened a fraction, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. "Of course," he said, his tone silky. "But you know how it is. Some people don't know when to stay in their lane." The words slid between them like a knife, sharp and glittering. Nova felt her breath catch, but she forced herself to hold his gaze, to let him see nothing but calm. "I know exactly where I belong," she said softly, the truth in her voice ringing like a bell. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, something that looked almost like surprise, and then it was gone, replaced by that familiar smirk as he straightened and stepped closer. "Good," he said, "because I'd hate to see you get in over your head." He reached past her to grab a bottle of water from the fridge, his shoulder brushing hers with deliberate intimacy. She didn't move, didn't let him see the way her heart slammed against her ribs. She waited until he was gone before she let out a slow breath, her hands shaking as she pressed them to the cold countertop. She knew he was testing her, probing for weakness. But she also knew he'd find none, because she had made her choice. And tonight, when she handed that folder to Maribel, she would prove that some truths couldn't be buried, no matter how deep the shadows dot. The rest of the day passed in a blur of half-finished tasks and the faint metallic taste of adrenaline on her tongue. Nova moved through the office like a ghost, her mind locked on the folder in her satchel and the plan that had crystallized overnight like a fragile snowflake of hope. She felt Victor's eyes on her more than once, his gaze a weight that pressed against her shoulders. But she didn't falter. Each polite smile she offered, each carefully measured word she spoke, was a shield she refused to lower. As the final hour of the day ticked by, the office began to thin, co-workers gathering their coats and laptops, the quiet murmur of conversation drifting down the aisles like the hush of a dying storm. Cole passed her desk just before 5, his fingers brushing her arm in a fleeting touch. "Are you ready?" he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. She nodded, her throat tight with the gravity of what lay ahead. "I'm ready," she said softly. Outside, the sky was darkening, the clouds heavy with the promise of rain. She gathered her things with deliberate care, her fingers steady even as her heart thundered in her chest. She could feel the weight of each movement, the silent chorus of every breath she took. This is it. There's no turning back. She met Cole in the lobby, the marble floors cold beneath her feet as they walked side by side out into the damp evening air. The city's lights shimmered in the puddles on the street, neon and gold and flickering white that caught in the corners of her eyes. They didn't speak as they walked, the hush between them thick with the knowledge that words were no longer enough. At the corner, Cole hailed a cab, his hand tight around the strap of his bag. The driver barely glanced at them as they climbed in, the car's interior warm and stale with the faint scent of pine air freshener. Nova clutched her satchel to her chest, the folder inside a quiet heartbeat against her ribs. She could feel the tremor in her hands as she smoothed them against the worn canvas, but she forced herself to breathe. She had come too far to let the fear win now. The cab's tires hissed on the wet pavement as it wound through the city's arteries, the glow of stoplights and storefronts slipping past in a kaleidoscope of color. Cole sat beside her, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Maribel's expecting us at 7, he said quietly, his voice pitched low to keep it safe from the driver's ears. "We'll hand it over and let her do the rest." Nova nodded, her breath fogging the cold window as she watched the city roll by. She thought of the documents in her bag, of the secrets they carried, secrets that could shatter Victor's carefully constructed world. And she thought of Victor himself, of the way he had smirked at her in the break room, so certain of his own untouchable power. She would show him that power built on fear was only a house of cards, and that even the smallest breath of truth could bring it all crashing down. The cab pulled to a stop in front of a low-slung brick building, the neon glow of a diner's sign washing the sidewalk in red and white. Cole paid the driver, and together they stepped out into the night, the air crisp and cold against their skin. Inside, the diner was warm and crowded, the clatter of dishes and the low hum of conversation wrapping around them like a thin shield against the dark. Maribel sat in a booth near the back, her dark hair pulled back in a loose knot, a tablet open in front of her. She looked up as they approached, her eyes sharp and assessing. "Nova Johnson?" she asked, her voice calm and professional. Nova nodded, her fingers tight around the strap of her satchel. "Yes," she said softly. Maribel gestured for them to sit, her gaze flicking to Cole and back. "Let's see what you got," she said. Nova slid into the booth, the vinyl seat squeaking beneath her. She pulled the folder from her bag, the weight of it like a living thing in her hands, and pushed it across the table to Maribel. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath as Maribel opened it, her eyes scanning the pages with a practiced focus that made Nova's pulse quicken. She could feel every beat of her heart, every breath that scraped in her chest as she waited. And when Maribel finally looked up, her expression was grave but certain. "This," she said quietly, "is enough to bring them down." Nova let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her shoulders sagging with the weight of relief and the cold certainty of what came next. "Are you sure?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. Maribel nodded. "I'll verify everything," she said, "but this is real, and it's going to change everything." Nova closed her eyes for a moment, the noise of the diner fading around her as she let that sink in. She had done it. She had taken the truth out of the shadows and put it in the hands of someone who could make it matter. And though fear still pressed at the edges of her thoughts, it no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a spark, like a beginning dot. Nova left the diner with her heart pounding so hard It felt like it would crack her ribs, her breath misting in the chill night air. She and Cole walked side by side down the slick sidewalk, the glow of neon signs and passing headlights washing their faces in shifting color. They didn't speak, the weight of what they had done settling around them like a mantle. The city felt different somehow, every shadow sharper, every footstep echoing with new purpose. They had handed over the truth, torn it from the walls that had hidden it for so long, and now there was no going back. At the corner, Cole stopped, his hand on her elbow, as he turned to face her. "Nova," he said softly, his voice low and rough. "Are you sure about this? You know what Victor is capable of." She met his eyes, the fear she had carried for so long, now a quiet, steady ember in her chest. "I know," she said, her voice calm. "But he doesn't own me. Not anymore." Cole searched her face, his jaw tightening, and then he nodded once, his hand dropping to his side. "Then we'll see this through together," he said, "no matter what comes next." She managed a small smile, the first real one she had felt in days, and for a moment the fear loosened its grip, replaced by the fierce, quiet pride that came from knowing she had done the right thing. They parted ways at the subway station, Cole vanishing down the steps into the fluorescent-lit tunnels, while she continued down the street, her satchel light now that its burden had been shared. The night was alive with possibility, the air crisp and electric against her skin. But as she walked, her phone buzzed in her pocket, the screen lighting up with a message that made her breath catch in her throat. Unknown number. "This isn't over, Nova. I know where you live." She stopped dead in her tracks, the city blurring around her as the words burned into her mind. She read it again, her hands going cold even as her pulse spiked hot in her veins. Victor. It had to be. She forced herself to keep moving, her footsteps quick and steady, her mind racing. She knew this was coming. She had known the moment she decided to stand up. But the threat felt different when it was aimed at her doorstep, at the quiet sanctuary she had built for herself. She reached her apartment, her fingers shaking as she turned the key in the lock and stepped inside. The familiar creak of the floorboards, the soft glow of the lamp by the couch, it all felt fragile, a thin layer of safety over something that could crack at any second. She locked the door behind her, checked the windows twice, her breath coming fast and shallow. But even as fear twisted in her gut, she felt something else, a steel thread of determination winding tight through her chest. She would not let Victor take this from her. She would not let him make her cower. She sat at her small kitchen table, the weight of the phone in her hand grounding her to the moment. She typed back with trembling fingers. "I'm not afraid of you." She hit send before she could second-guess herself, her heart hammering in her chest. The reply came almost instantly. "You should be." She stared at the words, the finality of them pressing down on her like a stone. But she didn't look away. She set the phone down carefully, her fingers brushing the smooth screen like a talisman. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes in their frames. She closed her eyes and let it wash over her, the cold bite of it a reminder that she was still here, still standing. And when she opened her eyes again, she was ready. She had started something that could not be undone, and she would see it through to the end. Dot. The following morning dawned brittle and gray, the clouds hanging low over the city like a shroud as Nova stepped out of her apartment and into the cold breath of dawn. The streets glistened from an overnight rain, and she kept her head down as she walked, her phone tucked deep in her pocket like a talisman against the memory of Victor's threat. Each step felt heavier than the last, but she refused to let her shoulders slump. She had chosen this path, and she would see it through. When she reached Barrow Construction, the lobby's marble floors felt colder than usual beneath her feet. The receptionist barely glanced up as she passed, her smile brittle and forced. Nova felt every eye that flickered her way as she moved through the maze of cubicles, her fingers tight around the strap of her bag. She took her seat, her gaze steady on the computer screen as she logged in. But her mind was miles away, already racing through every possibility, every risk. She didn't have to wait long. Before she could even settle into the rhythm of her day, the intercom crackled to life, the voice of Principal O'Brien, the usually affable man who managed the office floor, sounding more formal than she had ever heard. "Nova Johnson, please report to the principal's office immediately." The hush that fell over the cubicles was a living thing, the quiet crackling in the air like a static charge. Nova swallowed hard, her pulse quickening as she rose from her chair. She felt the weight of every gaze that followed her, the unspoken questions that crowded the air. She walked with careful calm, her breath steady, even as her palms turned slick with sweat. The principal's office was a glass-walled box at the end of the hallway, the blinds half drawn against the early light. As she pushed the door open, she found Principal O'Brien waiting behind his sleek wooden desk, his fingers steepled and his expression unreadable. But he wasn't alone. Two men in dark suits sat in the chairs across from him, their presence heavy with the quiet authority of men who did not need to speak to command a room. One was older, with silver at his temples and a calm gravity in his gaze. The other younger, his jaw tight, his eyes flicking to Nova as she stepped inside. "Miss Johnson," the older man said, his voice smooth but firm. "My name is Detective Harris. This is my partner, Detective Lynn. We'd like to ask you a few questions about some documents you recently handed over to a journalist." Nova felt her breath catch, her hands curling into fists at her sides. I don't understand," she said softly, though she knew exactly what they were asking. Detective Lynn leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees as he studied her. "Miss Johnson," he said, his voice gentle but unyielding, "we're not here to accuse you of anything. In fact, your cooperation is crucial. These documents, what you found, it's a matter of public interest. We're investigating a series of financial irregularities tied to city contracts, and we believe you may have the key to exposing it." Nova's throat tightened, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "You're talking about Victor Dane's family," she said quietly. "His father." The detective nodded once, his expression grave. "We've been gathering evidence for months," he said. "But what you uncovered, it could blow this case wide open." She swallowed hard, the magnitude of what she had done settling over her like a mantle. She thought of the names in her grandfather's ledger, the long reach of corruption that had always felt like something distant, something impossible to touch. And now, here it was, real and undeniable, laid out in the quiet conviction of these two men who had come to find her. "What do you need me to do?" she asked softly, her voice steady, even as her hands shook at her sides. Detective Harris gave her a small, encouraging smile. "We just need you to tell us what you know," he said. "Every detail, every scrap of paper, every conversation you can remember. We're building a case, but your testimony will be the cornerstone." Nova nodded, drawing a slow breath to steady herself. She thought of Victor's threat, of the cold gleam in his eyes when he said he knew where she lived. She thought of her grandfather's letter, the words that had carried her through the darkest nights. Silence only protects those who profit from wrongdoing, and she knew that she would not be silent. She sat down in the chair they offered her, her shoulders squared and her head held high. "I'll tell you everything," she said. "I'm not afraid of him anymore." The detectives listened carefully as Nova spoke, her voice steady as she recounted every detail she had uncovered, each receipt, each whispered conversation, each time Victor had tried to corner her into silence. The office fell away around her, the glass walls and muted hum of printers blurring into a distant haze as she laid bare the story she had carried alone for so long. Detective Harris took notes in a neat, measured hand, his pen scratching softly against the paper, while Detective Lynn leaned forward, nodding at her words, his questions probing but never harsh. They wanted the truth, every last thread of it, and she was ready to give it to them. As she spoke, she felt the fear that had dogged her for weeks begin to loosen its hold, replaced by a fierce resolve that burned bright and unwavering. When she finished, the room fell quiet. The only sound, the low buzz of the office beyond the door. Detective Harris closed his notebook, his expression grave but resolute. "Miss Johnson," he said softly, "you've done something extraordinary here. This is bigger than anything we expected. You've given us exactly what we need to move forward." She nodded, her shoulders aching with the weight of everything she had just shared, but in her chest there was a lightness she hadn't felt in weeks, a sense that she had finally stepped out of the shadows and into her own power. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice quiet but clear. Detective Lynn met her gaze, his eyes steady. "Now," he said, "we take this to the district attorney's office. There will be an investigation, real consequences. But it's not going to be easy, Nova. Victor's family has deep ties in this city. They'll fight back." She took a breath, feeling the truth of his words settle into her bones. "Let them," she said softly. "I'm done being afraid." Harris nodded, a small smile flickering across his face. "We'll be in touch," he said. "And Miss Johnson, if you ever feel threatened, If Victor or anyone connected to him tries to intimidate you again, you come straight to us. We'll make sure you're protected." She thanked them, her voice a whisper that carried all the strength she had left, and rose from her seat, her knees stiff from sitting so long. As she stepped out of the office and back into the corridor, the hush of the open floor seemed to crackle with a new kind of energy. Coworkers looked up from their screens as she passed, their eyes flicking to her and then quickly away, the weight of what she had done still too new, too raw to name. But she saw something in their gazes she hadn't seen before, a flicker of respect, of quiet admiration. She walked back to her desk with her head held high, each step a silent declaration that she would not be broken. Cole was waiting for her, his face tense until she gave him a small nod, just enough to let him know that she had spoken her truth, that the wheels were finally in motion. He let out a breath, his shoulders easing as he murmured, "Proud of you, Nova." She managed a faint smile, her pulse still thrumming in her ears. "It's not over yet," she said quietly, "but it's a start." As the afternoon wore on, the air in the office seemed to shift. Small conversations hushed when she drew near, nervous glances exchanged like secrets too heavy to voice. But Nova didn't shy away. She moved through the space with quiet determination, each breath a promise that she would not let Victor's shadow swallow her again. When she finally stepped outside that evening, the sky was streaked with the soft light of sunset, the city awash in gold and rose. She closed her eyes and let the warmth of it wash over her, her breath slow and steady in the hush of twilight. And in that moment, she felt it, the beginning of something new. The tide was turning, and she was ready to face whatever came next. The following days unfolded in a haze of whispered rumors and sudden silences, the weight of Nova's revelation rippling through the office like an echo of distant thunder. She could feel the undercurrent of tension in every glance cast her way, every cautious smile that flickered across a coworker's face. But she no longer shrank from it. She had carried her fear for so long, it had become a part of her, a secret shadow at the edges of every breath. And now, as she walked through the corridors of Barrow Construction, she felt it peeling away like old paint, leaving only the quiet steel of her resolve. Victor's desk sat empty most days, the leather chair turned slightly askew, as if he might return at any moment. But he didn't. And each day that passed without his smirk, without the chill of his presence, felt like a small victory she carried close to her heart. Cole remained a steady presence, his quiet support a balm against the lingering tremors of doubt. He met her in the break room one afternoon, the low hum of the coffee machine filling the space with its familiar warmth. "They're saying Victor's father is under investigation," he murmured, his voice pitched low. "The city council's in chaos. Half of them don't know which way to turn." Nova nodded, the news both sobering and electric. "Good," she said softly, her fingers curled around the warm paper cup. It's time they were held accountable. Cole watched her, his eyes searching, and then he smiled, a small, tired smile that held the promise of better days. "You did this, Nova," he said quietly. "Don't ever forget that." She held his gaze, the truth of it sinking into her bones, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she let herself believe it. When she returned to her desk, her phone buzzed with a message from Maribel, the journalist who had taken her grandfather's papers and turned them into a weapon of truth. "They're publishing the story tonight. It's going to be front-page news." Nova read the words again and again, her breath catching in her throat. She closed her eyes, the weight of everything she had risked pressing down on her shoulders. But beneath it all was a quiet, fierce pride, a knowledge that she had stepped out of the shadows and forced the world to see what it had long tried to hide. That evening, as she left the office and stepped out into the fading light, the city seemed to breathe around her, alive with possibility, with the promise of something new. She walked home through streets that smelled of rain and warm pavement, the neon signs flickering to life as the sky darkened above. At home, she settled into the worn cushions of her couch, the soft lamplight painting the walls in gold. She pulled out her grandfather's letter, the paper fragile beneath her fingertips, and read it one last time. "Silence only protects those who profit from wrongdoing." She traced the words with her thumb, the final line of a legacy that had become her own. And when she folded the letter and set it gently in the small box where she kept her most precious things, she did so with the quiet conviction of someone who knew that the story was far from over. Outside her window, the city moved on, unaware of the girl who had found her voice and used it to crack the walls of power. But Nova knew, and she knew that she would carry that voice with her into every room she entered, every conversation she held, every truth she spoke. Because she had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the choice to speak even when your voice trembled. And as she switched off the lamp and let the darkness settle around her, she felt that choice blaze bright in her chest like a star. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, its own shadows. But tonight, she was unafraid. In the end, Nova Johnson didn't just find the courage to stand up. She became the catalyst that forced an entire company to confront its darkest truths. Her story isn't just about taking on one powerful man. It's about refusing to let fear define who we are. It's a reminder that even in the face of threats and whispered warnings, one determined voice can spark a fire that no one can silence. So what about you? Have you ever faced a moment when standing up meant risking everything? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story moved you, make sure to like, subscribe, and stay tuned, because we're not done telling stories that matter.